Hey, folks. So I'm Dan. I'm a designer and a writer with Gigantic Mechanic, and let's talk about a project we did. So Gigantic Mechanic specializes in live-action games for events and installations and things like that. And the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the Senate hired us recently to design the centerpiece game for their Senate Museum, which will be opening in Boston in a couple of weeks, actually. That game is called the Senate Immersion Module, or the SIM for short. It's a mock Senate experience for high schoolers that uses a combination of live facilitators and tablet devices. It's kind of like Model Congress. It's meant to teach kids how the government works by having them create and vote on some law based around some real historical law. Now, one of the content modules for the sim, and the one I'll be talking about today, centers around the Compromise of 1850, which is a famous American law from before the Civil War. Here's some paper playtest footage of that content.
Students take on the role of real senators.
I'm Senator Thomas Hart Benton.
And play an active role in the sim.
Hello, my respected senators.
Gathering information to help make their voting decisions.
Daniel Webster of Massachusetts.
In hearings, they immerse themselves in learning about and voting on provisions.
What's your opinion on interstate trade?
Amendments, nominees,
He tried to call me out.
and the court issues under consideration that day.
Why, sir?
Banning slavery in the territories just hurts me more.
I know there's some abolitionists in the room here.
We should ban slavery in territories acquired from Mexico.
The experience culminates in the Institute's recreated Senate chamber for final action and roll call vote.
So that is 37 yays and 2 very principled nays.
Good for you guys. You passed the Compromise of 1850.
All right, so this is all well and good, right? You get to see me in an awful cravat from Etsy. But that video glosses over a huge design challenge we faced when we were writing this thing, that the Compromise was about slavery. Which means half of the random teenagers in each session of this game are playing slaveholders, which is tough, right? We had to create these totally reprehensible player characters, these slaveholding senators. We did not want to condone the attitudes or actions of these people, even implicitly. We wanted to be responsible about how we wrote them, because this was an educational product. But they still had to be easy for the kids to role play, otherwise the whole experience would just fall flat. These people needed to seem just real and relatable enough for people to be able to get into character as them, which is a tough line to walk. And maybe you're trying to walk it too. Whether you're writing a historical or a topical or educational game like we were, or if you're just writing an evil or a morally difficult character for dramatic effect, which is also perfectly legitimate, of course. Whatever the reason, let's say your protagonist is just not a good person, but you still want to try to design them right. So to help you out with that, here are 5 design steps that we use to solve this problem, how we try to design our morally difficult characters responsibly, and how you can do the same too if you'd like to. So one thing before you start designing this character, think of any groups of real-world people that could possibly be hurt or offended or otherwise affected by that character's actions. Now, have you involved these groups of people in the design process as experts or as fellow designers? Have you thoroughly researched their experiences as they relate to your game? And have you play-tested with them, early enough to change things about your design if you have to? If so, congratulations. If not, please do those things. Especially do those things if you are the whitest person in the known universe and you are writing a game that has slaveholders in it. We had this game extensively vetted by a very diverse, very knowledgeable group of experts. It's still being edited now. We tried our best throughout the entire process to check all of our basic assumptions and be respectful to our entire audience. So please do the same in your game. So, all that aside, the first step in this process is making your character feel safe to roleplay. Now, for example, in the sim, we always start out by giving kids this out-of-character introduction about their senators and their various historical attitudes, and then we say, okay, after you guys take the oath of office, which is a specific, very public in-game moment, everyone stands and raises their hands, everyone is going to start role-playing as their senators, and you're going to remain in character for the rest of the game, if you can. Now, why do we do this? Well, to make players feel comfortable playing a morally gray character, the game has to make it explicit that the players are different than their characters, because their characters are morally suspect. To do this, it helps to design a kind of dividing line moment early in your game, some point where players consent to moving from out of character to in character. It's a point where your player agrees to say, look, I'm not my avatar, but I promise to act like they would temporarily, so long as nobody judges me for it, whether you, the designer, or my fellow players. It gives them a safe space in which they can role play freely. Now, some games that do this safe space creation well. Shock is a tabletop story game. I personally love tabletop. I'll be talking about it a lot. It's about hard science fiction, and in the setup process of that game, each player explicitly agrees to be in charge of one tough socio-political topic that they'd like that session of the game to explore. Then, and only then, does everyone actually start role-playing the story. In other words, everyone has to buy into the uncomfortable stuff up front, then move from out of character to in character. Now, video games work a little bit differently than tabletop does, obviously. Here, your players expect to be in a safe space once they pick up your controller. They kind of take it as a given that they'll be playing someone that has different attitudes than they do, so you as designers, presuming you're in video games, don't have to do quite as much legwork to accommodate them. That said, some games do use a framing device that lets players distance themselves even further from their avatar's actions than they might otherwise be, kind of letting them go from out of character to in character to character playing a character. For example, Assassin's Creed is up there because first couple games in that series, the Animus lets players go from player to Desmond to whoever Desmond is embodying this week. So, now your players in character, they feel like it's safe to roleplay this morally questionable avatar. Well, we have yet to answer, obviously, who is that character, right? What's the first defining feature that you could design for them? Well, you could start by assigning them a faction within your game, and we do this in The Sim. Each senator caucuses and strategizes with the members of their faction, Northerners on one side and Southerners on the other. However, despite this, all of the scripts and game copy makes it clear that these factions aren't monolithic. The members of each faction have a range of different opinions on slavery, even in the South. And aside from a couple of abolitionists, nearly everyone in both factions has at least some morally questionable stances, even in the North. Yeah. Likewise, voting solely with your faction, whether you're pro or anti-slavery, is no more valid of a game strategy than compromising with the other side. Ultimately, it's up to players' consciences what they do. And these are how the senators voted in real history, by the way. Now, why did we go to all of this trouble? Well, giving your character factions to pick from, or a moral choice system to play around with, or just making them part of some unified group can help your players invest in your game world. Gives them a team or a moral category to identify with and be a part of. That said, if your central character is morally ambiguous, those factions have to be nuanced. Remember, it's going to be difficult enough for your player to identify with this character in the first place. So that character has to feel like a real person with a complex personality and a bunch of different motivations. If your character's faction is too black and white, if your good guys are too good and your bad guys are too evil, that will overwhelm any other interesting traits that that character might have. And any role-playing your players do will just come across as caricature. You'll think you're designing Macbeth, and they will be playing Skeletor, or Gargamel, or Bowser, for that matter. Someone whose primary character trait is bad guy. In other words, they won't take your character as seriously as ideally you want them to. So how can you go from Mario versus Bowser, good versus evil factions, to something a little bit more multidimensional and nuanced? Well, you could make sure that there's a range of different people in each faction, with a range of different moral philosophies and backgrounds. Maybe some of Bowser's minions just want to trade with the Mushroom Kingdom. Maybe Mario hangs out with some radical pro-democracy agitators, things like that. That way, your player wouldn't feel like they had to agree with every single bit of their faction's party line, no matter which one they ended up joining. They'd feel like they had room for some inner life and independence as well, because there are a bunch of other people in their faction that think all sorts of things. You could also make sure that Mario's people have some significant moral blind spots, and that some of Bowser's folks were legitimately sympathetic, that neither faction was uniformly right or wrong. That way, your player could always think of themselves as reasonable. They always have someone on their team to look up to, even if everyone else is just terrible, and they can always point to someone on the other team that proves that those guys are just totally misguided. And if you do give the player gameplay bonuses for siding with one team over the other, you'd give them just as much for charting a middle path. That way you can be sure that your player is making that choice for narrative reasons alone, and not just because it'll get them new stuff. You make your player's faction nuanced like this, and they won't join it so they can be the archetypal good guy or the bad guy, or because it'll let them shoot lasers or whatever. They'll identify with it just because it seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do, like their character would, for that matter. And they'll probably still do that even if their faction has some truly terrible people in it, even if those people are in the majority, to be honest. So a couple of games that do complex factions and moral choice systems well. D&D should get more credit for this, actually. Its alignment system has 9 different categories in it. There's a lawful versus chaotic axis, as well as a good versus evil axis, and you can kind of slot your characters into any section on that graph. Now, not every dungeon master highlights this, of course, but it gives some space in the system for ethical conflicts between characters that cut across traditional good versus evil lines. Now, in video games, I really like Papers, Please for this. Inasmuch as there are factions in that game at all, you can choose between following your oppressive totalitarian government and helping the very shady resistance movement that wants you to go on suicide missions occasionally. And at any given point, your moral choice might be between doing your job well to get paid and feed your starving family, or being a good Samaritan to the people coming through your border checkpoint, even if it means mismarking a couple of passports. There's positives and negatives to anything you can do, and no easy answers for any of it. So, your morally complex character now has this morally complex faction. Well, what else do they have driving them? Well, in the sim, we give each player a kind of character sheet on their tablet that has their senator's political positions on it. Take Stephen Douglas here, for example. Now, one of his positions is directly linked to his faction. He's from Illinois, it's a northern state, and thus opposed to slavery. But faction isn't everything. He has 5 more positions that have nothing to do with it. We can see here that he supports farming, for example, because Democrats, like him, love farmers. Now, these positions tie into players' voting strategies. They can pick from a bunch of different proposals to add to the bill, like this one here, and each proposal has a bunch of different impacts, like this would be bad for farming, or this would be anti-slavery. Now, players get to debate which of these things they want to vote for and add to the bill, and usually they'll start out with really mechanical arguments. You know, I oppose California statehood because it is bad for farming, things like that. And then they'll gradually start to get into it over time, and you'll get these grand, dramatic speeches about how the great corn growers of Illinois would never countenance such a dastardly measure, things like that. It's good theater, if nothing else. So why does this happen, and why do we structure things so that it happens? Well, you can write the most nuanced, richly textured narrative in the world, and some of your players won't care. They will fast forward past your dialogue, they will press square to skip your cutscenes, they will ignore every single audio diary you have spent production time recording, and they will just shoot a lot of things because that is what they want to do. So, how do you get this perfectly legitimate segment of your audience invested in actually role-playing this morally difficult person that you went to such trouble to design? Well, you have to trick them. They don't care about your narrative, but they probably do care about winning your game. So if every time they follow one of their character's narrative desires, they get a little gameplay reward, they'll be motivated to act the way their character would, despite themselves. Now, I don't just mean throw them some experience points whenever they finish a mission. I mean give them points for sharing their character's motivations. It's a subtle distinction, but here's what I mean. So you can give your character a bonus for following their faction, right? A lot of games do this. But remember what we talked about earlier. For the character to feel real, they have to have a whole bunch of motivations besides their faction. So think of some other motivations. These should be things that the character thinks they value. Personal traits to cultivate, abstract goals they want to achieve, things like that. Now, rule of thumb, if you can't imagine an actual reasonable person saying they would support one of these things, they probably wouldn't, so don't include it in your system. Now, pursuing these motivations should have quantitative rewards. Otherwise, the more checked out people in your audience won't care. Roll these terms into your game mechanics. If a player kills one of their sworn enemies, tell them, hey, you got an honor point and some resolve points. Good for you. This will teach them why their character wants to act the way they do gradually. Now, keep in mind, a character's motives might conflict with one another sometimes. Executing a popular criminal could give them law points but dock them public image, for example. Now, if you do this, Even the cutscene skippingest players will start thinking and acting like your character does eventually. They might start out saying to themselves, okay, killing this guy gets me honor and resolve points. I want points, so I'm going to do it. But it's a short mental jump from there to thinking killing these guys is honorable and resolute, especially when they're acting instinctively in the moment. So, a couple of games that do this motives to mechanics linkage well. Again, tabletop, go play anything in the Lady Blackbird system. It's a steampunk game. There are a bunch of pre-generated characters, and it gives players experience points or more dice to roll whenever they play to their character's narrative desires. And everyone has a bunch of these different desires called out. So if Captain Vance acts like a good commanding officer, he gets points. But if he acts on his secret longing for Lady Blackbird, he also gets points. And those desires might conflict occasionally. Now, seriously, just go play Persona 4 for a lot of reasons, but also it's very, very good at this. The members of your adventuring party in that game get more powerful in combat the closer your relationships are with them. And you get relationship points with each one by just hanging out with them after school and picking especially friendly dialogue options. So even if you just started out caring about winning battles, if you're a better friend, you get more points. And the game system will eventually sucker you into actually caring about these people through that system. So one last thing about these motivations. They should be based on your character's subjective beliefs, what they think they are aspiring to. Which means if your character actually is morally suspect, some of these should be perverse incentives in disguise. In other words, keep giving them honor and resolve points even when they are slaughtering the forces of good. They will still think instinctively that they are being honorable and resolute, just like their characters, unfortunately. And you'll have given them enough of these little intersecting motivations to keep track of that their attention will be split. They might not even notice when they're following one of the bad motives. I've had kids argue vociferously in the sim for pro-slavery measures because the game system says that that proposal would be good for the cotton industry, which is terrifying, obviously. But one of our design goals was to put the kids in that mindset, at least temporarily. So, our character now has this complex-seeming faction and a bunch of different motivations, but they're not quite finished yet. In the sim, besides those 6 positions I talked about, we give each senator in the game a short bio, just totally narrative, a couple of quirks and details that have nothing to do with their politics. Things like religion, like rivalries, secrets. Yeah, William King is great. Personal histories. Oh, Houston. Or family members. Now, granted, these facts here are from a first draft, but they were the kinds of bios that we were shooting for. They have no game value at all, but the kids really get into them. They use them as role-playing hooks when they're in debate. Now, why do we do this? Well, again, you want your player character to feel like an actual person. And even the worst actual people have little traits like these. Stuff that has nothing to do with their career or their mission or with ruling the galaxy or whatever. I mean, sure, they have a bunch of important quantitative motivations driving them towards their game goals, but you want to make sure that those motivations are kind of floating in a stew of other personal details. Just qualitative, purely narrative stuff that has nothing to do with the main thrust of the game. Give them secrets. Give them hobbies. Give them relationships. And make sure that none of those details are obvious plot developments in disguise, because that'll just make your player think that everything in their character's life secretly has to do with their mission, which is the opposite of what you want. You want these details to make your player feel like their character has a rich and complex life outside of work. And they'll do that. It'll make the character seem more relatable and more realistic. But if that character is morally suspect, these details will do something else as well. They will be distractions, because your player will be role-playing a lot of pretty terrible decisions. And these little personality quirks will say, hey, look over here at this humanizing detail. How evil can you possibly be if you own a puppy? What you're not saying, of course, is that, especially in real life, it's very easy to be both human and to act evilly at the same time. Now, a couple of games that do these small-scale details well. Fiasco is great at this in tabletop. I heard it brought up prior day of the conference, seriously, go play it. Basically an improv a Coen Brothers caper movie in 2 hours sort of game. And during setup of that game, players kind of accrete the session's central characters out of this randomized pool of low-level traits. Who has what relationships with who has shared needs or objects or personal histories that are important to everyone collectively. And then the story focuses heavily on those traits, even though they have no intrinsic gameplay value. And even though most of the characters end up kind of low-lifey because the trait's on offer, everyone still ends up getting into it. Now, in video games, I like Valiant Hearts for this, the World War I puzzle game, just because it has actual German soldiers in it that have humanizing character traits, like friendships with allied characters, for example. All right, so you've given your players this fleshed-out character to role-play. Well, what now? Well, let them act like their character would. In the sim, all the kids actually create and vote on this bill, and it usually ends up looking something like the actual Compromise of 1850. Because of all the incentives we're giving them, there's usually some pro-slavery stuff in there. And then at the very end of the game, like you saw in the video, there's this big public roll call moment where everyone votes either for or against this bill they made, and all the facilitators say, you know, congratulations. And then they say, okay, now you're not your senators anymore, you're yourselves again. Let's talk about why you voted the way you did. At which point we give them some context for this bill that everyone purely voluntarily proposed to the Senate floor. And everyone talks about it, and usually gets a little bit awkward. Now, why do we do this? Well, let's review our process so far. Your player feels safe acting like their character. Their faction is nuanced and not overwhelming, so it's only one small part of their motivation. Instead, they're free to chase their character's subjective small-scale desires all over the place, which inevitably leads them to some very dark decisions, while humanizing details distract them from the fact that they are behaving badly. In other words, your player is now thinking exactly like a realistic, morally difficult person. And all you have to do is let them play your game. You prime them to make some terrible decisions voluntarily. Congratulations. And also you've created a pretty serious problem here because you've basically tricked your player into being evil through game design. Remember, you want to be responsible as a designer. You do not want to condone your player character's actions. And if you don't help your players realize that they're being immoral, if they never think critically about what they've done when they were playing your game, they might come away from the experience thinking that their character is just a really cool person, which is obviously not what you want. So how do you prevent this from happening? Well, you put your player in this safe in-character space at the beginning of your game. Now take that safety away. Shock them out of role-playing. Break the fourth wall if you have to. Address them out of character and ask them what they think of the decisions that their character made while they were acting in the moment. Ask them why they made those decisions. Now, don't accuse them of anything, right? Let them judge themselves. But they'll probably realize that their character was doing stuff that they themselves would be very uncomfortable with if they were to do it in real life. And they will feel bad about that. So a couple of games that manage this final bit well. In tabletop, Brenda Romero's Train is great at this. Now, it's tough to talk about Train without spoiling the ending, but late in the game, players realize where the train is going. And it's somewhere that they themselves would think is morally repugnant, but that their character would be just fine with. In other words, it's an appeal to the player's out-of-character knowledge. And that disconnect stops them from identifying with their character. It invites them to judge the morality of their actions during the game using their own personal standards. Now, Spec Ops: The Line, which got brought up in the last talk, was a great example of this in video games. It's a shooter, and your character is drawn into committing this downward spiral of military atrocities, and as they do, later on in the game, even the loading screen text starts calling out the player's hypocrisy, like here. Now, one of the last lines in the game is said to the main character, but could just as easily apply to the player. The truth is that you're here because you wanted to feel like something you're not, a hero. Now, regardless of how you do it, this last step here is the most important one. Because, yeah, if you use these techniques, your players will probably play your morally difficult character realistically, and enthusiastically even. But if you stick this last bit, you'll accomplish something even better. You'll get them to reflect on how simple it was for them to act in an evil way. Now, I came back to this quote a lot when I was writing the sim. You should understand how easily you could have been the slave master. And it's true, unfortunately. If we were born into these slave owners' lives and had the wrong set of motivations driving us, we all could have made the same kind of mistakes that they did. which means it's incumbent on us to make sure that we don't make those mistakes, that we don't take our own morality for granted. Now, by creating experiences like these for our players, by putting them in the mindset of these characters and then making them reflect on their actions when they were in the moment, we can teach them this hard truth firsthand. It's something that only games can do, and I think we should try to do it well if we can. Thank you.